everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating geopolitical analysis from Geopolitical Futures. We are going to decode the deep-seated, incredibly complex dynamic between the United States and Cuba. We're going to strip away the daily headlines and uncover the raw geography, the history, and the harsh strategic reality that actually defines this relationship.
So we have to start with a fundamental question. Why is the US so incredibly obsessed with Cuba? If you ask most people, they'll instantly point to the 1960s, right? They'll say it's all about the Cold War, Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. But here is the really fascinating thing the source material points out. That assumption completely misses the bigger picture. This tension, it didn't start in the 1960s. It actually started long before the world had even heard the word communism.
The real answer, the stark underlying reality of this entire issue comes down to this one number, 90. 90 miles. That is the distance between Key West, Florida and the shores of Cuba. As you'll see throughout this explainer, you simply cannot understand American geopolitics without understanding the sheer proximity of this island.
Here's our roadmap for today. We've got 1, a century of obsession, 2, the geography of fear, 3, inside today's Cuban regime, 4, the American playbook, and 5, the ultimate geopolitical threat.
Section 1, a century of obsession, tracing the historical roots of US-Cuba tension. We are rewinding the clock way back, far past the Cold War to the early 19th century, when Cuba was actually still a territory owned by Spain. Now, it's really interesting how the source frames the Monroe Doctrine. Issued back in the 1800s, this was a US policy strictly aimed at keeping European and foreign powers out of the Western Hemisphere. And the analysis argues that this doctrine was issued very much with Cuba in mind. The young United States simply did not trust foreign powers sitting right off its southern coast, potentially blocking its access to the open ocean.
Tracing the timeline, you can see how this early obsession just compounded over the years. The 1800s gave us that Monroe Doctrine. Then, in 1898, we had the Spanish-American War. Think Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill, which, by the way, was in Cuba. The US essentially took Cuba from Spain. Fast forward to the 1960s, and we hit the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the US literally nearly went to nuclear war with the Soviets over the island. And that brings us to the present era, characterized by economic collapse and ties to Latin American cartels. The source makes it crystal clear. The US focus on Cuba is not some new invention. It is a centuries-old strategic imperative.
Section 2, the geography of fear, the vital trade route of the Gulf of Mexico.
So why does the physical location of this specific island terrify American strategists so much? Well, according to the analysis, there is a staggering statistic. At least half, 50%, of all the goods the United States imports or exports travel not through the east or west coast, but right through the Gulf of Mexico. The Straits of Florida act as this primary, absolutely critical artery for getting massive cargo ships in and out of the American heartland.
And here is where the physical geography becomes a massive headache for US planners. Cuba spans the exact distance between New York and Chicago. Think about that for a second. It is a massive, long, thin barrier island. If a hostile power were to place submarines or sea mines in the waters around Cuba, it could effectively bottleneck and block the entire Gulf of Mexico. Geopolitical Futures notes the economic devastation to the US would be absolute. It's an old fear from the world wars, but strategically, the map hasn't changed a bit.
Section 3, inside today's Cuban regime, from ideological communism to a military-run syndicate. With that huge geographical reality in mind, what is actually happening on the island today? According to the analysis from Geopolitical Futures, we need to completely update our mental model of the Cuban government. Fidel Castro's Cuba? That was deeply ideological, heavily communist, and heavily backed by the Soviet Union. But today's Cuba? The source notes it is essentially non-ideological now. Instead, it's run by the Cuban army, which acts a lot less like a traditional government and more like a massive corporation, or even a criminal syndicate, complete with ties to regional cartels.
The results of this military-run system are frankly catastrophic. We are looking at a severe economic collapse. The general public is living in third-world conditions, dealing with widespread, agonizing power outages. Yet, the starkest point the source makes is the vast inequality here. The army remains well-to-do and deeply resourced, while the civilian population suffers immensely.
Section 4, the American playbook, current US strategy and pressure tactics. Given this dire situation and the island's strategic location, what exactly is the United States doing about it? The crucial point is that the US has actually learned from past mistakes, like that disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. A direct ground war would be incredibly costly and bloody. Instead, the analysis predicts a calculated three-step strategy. Step 1, apply maximum economic pressure, including blocking oil shipments. Step 2, simply stand back and allow the internal standard of living to decline further under the regime's own weight. Step 3, wait. Just wait for conditions to become so disastrous that either the army fractures from within or the public rises up to overthrow the system themselves.
But the strategy isn't totally hands-off, which leads to this really fascinating question from the source material. Why did the head of the CIA recently make a highly unusual visit to Havana? I mean, it is incredibly rare for an operational CIA chief to conduct open negotiations with a hostile foreign government.
While the US has three broad options: covert operations, direct military strikes, or just letting them sweat it out, the source offers a really compelling theory on that CIA visit. Geopolitical futures suggest it was a massive intelligence signal. Sending an operational chief wasn't about diplomacy. It was likely a bold move to show the Cuban regime exactly how deeply the US has penetrated their operations. It's basically a way of saying, we know everything you're doing and you are entirely visible to us. It is psychological pressure at the absolute highest level.
Section 5. The ultimate geopolitical threat. Why occupied islands terrify superpowers. So, if the Cuban military is just focused on internal control and making money, what is the US actually afraid of today? This brings us to the core thesis of the entire analysis. Cuba is not a problem in itself. The Cuban army has absolutely no offensive capabilities to invade the United States, no way. The ultimate threat to the US is foreign occupation. The real fear among strategists is that a weak, desperate Cuba might invite a massive foreign power, like Russia or China, to set up military bases, missiles, or troops right on that 90-mile border.
And this actually builds into a universal geopolitical law. Superpowers are always terrified of offshore islands falling to hostile forces. For the United States, it's Cuba, bringing the historical threat of a nuclear base or blockade. But look at China. They view Taiwan the exact same way, as a potential blockade to the Pacific Ocean. Historically, Britain viewed Ireland through the same lens, fearing a hostile power could use the island to launch a naval blockade against London. Geography dictates strategy, no matter where you are on the map.
Which leaves us with this famous, deeply evocative Cuban saying to wrap up our explainer today: too far from God and too close to the United States. It perfectly summarizes the inescapable destiny of the island. Cuba's location is its defining geopolitical feature. It binds its fate to the superpower right next door. It really makes you wonder, as we watch this current crisis unfold, does geography ultimately equal destiny? Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the maps, and I'll see you next time.